Now, the next thing I want to talk about is clusters of galaxies. Galaxies are actually found in clusters of galaxies, even more than stars are found in clusters of stars. Nearly every galaxy we see is in a cluster. The Milky Way belongs to a very small cluster that we call the local group. It contains about 30 members, with the three largest members being the spiral galaxies M31, M33, and the Milky Way. Most of the local group galaxies are faint, small dwarf galaxies, ragged, disorganized collections of stars with very little or no gas that can't be seen in other clusters. The Magellanic Clouds are in our local group. The Large Magellanic Cloud is about 1/10 of the mass of our galaxy. It's in orbit around us. The Andromeda Galaxy, which we've talked about 2 million light years away. Again, depending on how you add it, there's about 20 to 30 members of the local group. So here's some pictures of M33, M31. There's some dwarf galaxies here. We have the Milky Way with the Magellanic Clouds around it. So as we look out in the sky, we see that the galaxies are found in these clusters. Now, galaxies within these clusters are held together by their mutual gravity. And typical cluster size is several million light years across and contain a handful to some that have several thousand galaxies. Now, this galactic cluster is actually lensing something behind it. We can see it. See, we have these arced objects in here. These are all objects that are behind this cluster of galaxies that, as the light's coming around, is lensed. And so from these arcs, then, we're actually able to measure the mass of the cluster. Now, the largest groups of galaxies contain hundreds to thousands of member galaxies. Large gravity puts galaxies into basically a spherical distribution. They contain mainly elliptical and SO galaxies. Spirals just tend to be on the fringes of the cluster. Giant ellipticals tend to be near the center. We think this is due to cannibalism. They contain large amounts of mass, maybe 10 to the 12th or 10 to the 14th solar masses of extremely hot X-ray emitting gas with very little heavy elements. Here's a picture of the Hercules cluster of galaxies. Most of the objects that we see here are galaxies. Here we have two galaxies that are in the act of colliding. We have elliptical galaxies, we have spiral galaxies, just a very rich, diverse group of galaxies. These are other clusters of galaxies that we see. We see several good ellipticals and spirals, or this one, another two galaxies that are in the act of colliding. Now, poor clusters have only a dozen or so member galaxies. They're ragged, have an irregular look. There's a high proportion of spirals and irregulars. Our own local group is a poor cluster. Now, in general, all clusters need dark matter to explain the galactic motions and the confinement of hot intergalactic gas within the cluster. Near clusters appear to have their members fairly smoothed out, while far away clusters, and therefore younger because the light's taken longer to get there, so we're looking at them as they were a long time ago, are more ragged looking. This suggests that clusters form by galaxies attracting each other into groups, as opposed to clustering forming out of a giant gas cloud. Now, as we look out there, what we see is that clusters aren't the largest object we see. We also have clusters of clusters, and we call those superclusters. So a group of galaxy clusters can be gravitationally attracted to each other into a larger structure called a supercluster. It contains a half dozen to several dozen galaxy clusters spread over tens to hundreds of millions of light years. Our local group belongs to the local supercluster. Superclusters have irregular shapes and are themselves part of even larger groups. We have one that's called the Great Wall. It's a lot of superclusters that are sprung out in a wall. And there's another supercluster we call the Great Attractor. And so our local supercluster contains us, the local group, and the M81 group, the M101 group, the Virgo cluster, the Ursa Major cluster, over a span of about 100 million light years. So now as we start to look at the very largest things out there, the structure of the universe itself, we have this map here. This map shows a small portion of the sky, and every little blue dot we see here is a galaxy. And we see strings of galaxies forming superclusters, or the clumpiness getting together in a larger thing. So this would be a cluster of superclusters. So there's a lot of structure in the universe, and we're trying to understand why. Why is it not just everything smoothly distributed everywhere? Why do we have all this clustering? And that is one of the mysteries and problems that cosmologists are trying to determine.